Welcome to Lecture 2 for English 298. Today I want to introduce drama by discussing some of the terminology of shape. As we read and analyze drama closely, we need to know the language and terminology involved in that process. What is it that's actually happening that we should be looking for and that we should be able to communicate to our own readers when we go about the business of analyzing a play? So some of what we're going to talk about today is essentially everything in a drama boils down to action. Drama is action. Without constant and consistent action in a play, nothing happens and we no longer have a play. Because we can rely on other things in narratives or poems to keep the reader's interest or the audience interest, there doesn't always have to be an action occurring. Drama is very different. One thing needs to lead to the next thing at all times. So we're going to talk about how to look at what happens in the play, and then what happens next, and then the importance of being able to look at those things not just in sequence from beginning to end, but to be able to do that backwards, to really get to the heart of the action and how everything in a play is interconnected, at least if the play is done well. We'll talk about the terms stasis and intrusion, which are sort of the heart and soul of drama, along with obstacle and conflict. So those four terms, or really those two sets of terms, work very closely together. And then we'll briefly touch on some theatrical things, which you will also follow up on in your reading for this week, your supplemental reading. So when we're talking about what happens, what we're talking about is the fact that an action occurs when something happens that makes or permits, allows something else to happen, right? So we're not just concerned with the fact that, oh, something in this play just occurred. What we really want to know is what is happening that is propelling other things? What is happening that is allowing other things to happen next? An event, on the other hand, is anything that happens. But an event is actually made up of two things, right? So when one event causes or permits another event, those two events together is really what we call action. All right, so this is a little bit different when we're talking about dramatic action. It's a little bit more complicated, a little bit more complex than when we're talking about something like action in a novel, in a prose narrative. That could be one single thing, right? If we talk about action in The Catcher in the Rye, we might be talking about one specific thing that Holden Caulfield does that is an action that he takes. In our context of drama, action refers to two connected events, one thing leading to another thing, which will lead to another thing, and that is our sequence, our series of actions. So as you're reading Edward II, you have the first half due this week. You'll have the second half due next week. Something that you should be asking yourself all the time as you're reading through the scenes is, what is it that's happening that's making something else happen? So if you're paying close attention and not just being swept along by the story, you should be able to start making connections between those things that occur that have some bearing on what occurs afterwards, and start to put those pieces together like a puzzle, right? How are they interconnected? If one were taken away, where would the action, where would the drama stop? Actions, in other words, are a play's building blocks. Without actions, without those sequences of conjoined events, there is no play, there's no drama. In poetry, we would say something like language is really the building block, right? Because that is what propels a poem forward, that creates the emotion and the intrigue. In narrative, it's the plot and the characters plus the description that are the building blocks, right? So in a long work like a novel where you have narration plus character development, then you get a combined sense of what's going on. Drama, it's all about the action. One thing happens that leads to another, that leads to another, that leads to another. And there's not a whole lot of narration. There's not always much character development. It's really about what's going on. Once we can establish okay, what are these coordinated sequences of events and which actions are being created by those events. We can get a little bit more detailed and we look at what's called the trigger and the heap. So every action causes or permits a second event. Each event causes another event. That trigger event, which is the first event, plus a heap event, or the second event, combined equals one dramatic action. So that's one thing to really keep in mind here is when we're talking about action, remember that we're talking about a first event plus a second event together. And those first and second events have specific terms, the trigger and the heap. Now, where things get really complicated and we have to be very careful in our analysis or our evaluations and our descriptions of what's happening in any particular scene is that a heap event, the second event to occur in an action, is caused by a trigger, yes, but it's also going to become its own trigger for something else that happens next. And that's what we mean about the puzzle, right? The pieces coming together. There is a real genuine connectivity between every single thing that happens in a good play. Everything is related. Where in a novel you've got 600 pages littered with description and asides and plots and subplots, you may have actions and events that propel the entire story forward, but they don't necessarily relate to each other 100% all of the time. In a play, that is simply not the case. One event absolutely leads to the second event, the trigger leads to the heap, and then that heap becomes a trigger for something else that will happen after it. So performing a sequential analysis, going in order from beginning to end of the events that happen as you're reading the play, is going to help you understand that play a little bit better, a little bit more fully, and how one thing leads to another. So let's take our play Edward II for an example. We've got early on in the play, right, a trigger. Gaveston returns to England. So Edward I dies, Edward II is going to ascend to the throne. That means that Gaveston can come home, basically. So the trigger is Gaveston comes back. That's the first event. The heap, the second event that is caused directly because of Gaveston's return, is Edward gives him a lot of stuff, right? So he gives him a title, he gives him money, access to the treasury, all sorts of prestige. He essentially elevates Gaveston to a level in which he did not belong. That's a trigger and a heap combined. There's one action there. But if you look closely, if you continue along with this thread, that heap of Edward bestowing gifts on Gaveston because he's come home becomes a trigger for something else. When Edward II bestows those gifts on Gaveston, it causes his court, Edward's court, to become angry, jealous, right? They are not happy with this elevation that Gaveston is receiving for a variety of reasons. But that's a new heap caused by the former heap, which is now a trigger. And we can keep going and going and going throughout the entire play like this, right? And that's what close analysis is all about. That heap, Edward's court becoming jealous, becomes a new trigger for the next event. So when the court becomes jealous, they decide to let their emotions manifest in a demand that Edward exile Gaveston again, right? So Gaveston comes home, which leads to his being gifted and elevated. That leads to the court being angry, which leads to the court demanding something of Edward. Trigger leads to a heap. Heap becomes a trigger, which leads to a heap, and on and on and on. So if you look at this pattern here, we've got three actions. Give yourself some time here and think about, if you've done some of the reading the early part of Edward II, I think you can come up with for yourself then what is the next action, right? What would be the next trigger in this scenario if we're following the pattern? And what does that trigger lead to? Which event comes next? And what event is caused because of that first event, that trigger? When you can do that forward, right, as you're reading through the play, and you obviously read from beginning to end, you can start following that pattern. It's laid out for you. That's how the direction in which it's written, after all. When you can do it forward, and you can identify each of those events which create each of those actions that make up the sum total of what happens in the play, then what you really want to do is see if you can not necessarily read the play backwards, but see if you can identify the relationship by what happens in reverse. So if you start with the events and actions at the end of the play once you've finished reading it and go backwards, you're going to get a deeper sense of just how important, just how connected those events were, right? So you read it in sequence from start to finish. That can sometimes make things that happen seem kind of arbitrary. Yeah, you're following along with the story, something happens and then something happens, and okay, right? Why did any of that have to happen? We don't necessarily know. It's just the thing that happened in chronology, in time order. But after you've read the play and you start to examine these things backwards, you can look very closely at how each of those dominoes fell forward in the first place. And what does that mean for the play, right? What does that mean for the dramatic implications that every single one of those events or actions had on the sequence of the play? And that is what leads to a stronger comprehension, right, of what happened in the play, how complex it was, how interrelated each of these events were. If you pull out an action in the middle of the play and examine it backwards and forwards, what is it connected to? What led to it? What did it lead to later? You'll see that removing any one of these actions, any set of two events together, would have stopped the play, right? We would not have had the same play in the end. So going forward allows for some unpredictable possibility, right? Anything could happen. Everything could happen. It seems arbitrary, like the playwright could have come up with anything else following an event. But you read it backwards and you realize that, well, certain things actually had to happen if the play was going to happen. If we were going to get the story, the drama that unfolds in the manner in which we have it, right, from start to finish, those events actually had to occur. And they don't seem so arbitrary if we look at it that way. Now, in your evaluation, there are some things, 4 terms to help you, whether you're looking at the play in sequence from start to finish, or you're returning and performing some of this analysis out of order to get a deeper sense of what's happening. You want to know, first of all, the terms stasis and intrusion. All right, this is what a play is all about. It's the up and down momentum. Think of it like waves, right? A play begins with stasis, and its goal is to end with some kind of stasis. And what I mean by that is a certain motionlessness, right? A state of rest. So stasis is a condition of balance among the various forces at work. It's literally a standing still or an unchanging stability, right? Everything comes to a balance. There is no movement. It's just what is. It is the reality of a current moment. So that being said, usually the beginning of a play is a state of stasis. We're starting a story at the place where reality lies. This is how the world is in this particular time and place. That is stasis. Ultimately, actions will occur, events will happen that cause changes in that stasis, and the entire motivation of the play from that point forward will be to find a new stasis, a new normal, right, to get back to. Those things that happen upon the stasis, those things that change the stasis, are called intrusions, right? An intrusion is a movement. It's a forced kind of action. You can think of it like a pushing or a thrusting or a forcing in of something else upon the status world. Usually this will change everything that can be changed, right? So when we have a state of normalcy, of balanced reality, something, an intrusion, will happen that causes that reality to change significantly, so that that world that existed before no longer does. That is not the reality anymore. So one thing to remember is that the goal of every play is either to find stasis or to reestablish the stasis that was lost over the course of those action creating events. Intrusions will propel the action forward. Stasis, when it's finally reached, will bring all of it to a close, and that's typically the way that a play ends. There is a new normal. There's always also going to be this battle, this tension between stasis, intrusion upon that stasis, and then the play's attempt to find some new stasis or to get back to the original state of being. So in reviewing Edward II, you want to, once you finish, see if you can identify, has stasis been achieved? Is it a return to the beginning, right? Is it back to the normalcy of where we began the play, where the story started? Or is it a new stasis? Is there a new normal? Is there a calm in the world that's being relayed to us, but that calm is different from where we began in the first place? So, for example, in Edward II, the stasis we begin with is the fact that Edward I has died. Edward II has ascended to the throne. And Gaveston, who had been exiled during the reign of Edward I, right? That's the balance. That's the way of the world at the time the play begins. It is the starting point. So no new action, no new event has quite happened yet. And stasis may last all of one sentence in a play, right? It's usually interrupted pretty quickly. In Edward II, that intrusion happens, that first intrusion, with Gaveston re-entering the country. Everything will change from that point forward about the way of this world. And we know that that change comes from, in this place, Edward affording Gaveston titles and money and security. Gaveston basically ascends from a commoner who has been exiled to the level of nobility, with a direct access to the king. Some would say an outsized influence on the king, which makes people very unhappy. So these are the first actions that set in motion every other change that will take place in the world of this particular drama. This first intrusion is the first event, which will lead to the second event, which forms the first action, and on and on and on. Because this intrusion happened, nothing else can stay the same. The other two terms that are directly related that we need to know are obstacle and conflict. And because drama is just really sequences of actions, right, made up of sequences of events, that means drama is conflict. Without conflict, a drama goes nowhere. There's not really much character development. There's not much, if any, narration. You'll get stage direction here and there, right, which is not really meant for the story so much as it is for the performance of the story. So drama has to be conflict, or it doesn't exist. Dramatic conflict, though, is a particular kind of interaction. It's an interaction that's deeply rooted in and inalienable from real-life human behavior. All right? So this is different sometimes from the narrative prose conflict or the conflict of poetry. Sometimes dramatic conflict or hyperbolic conflict can be found in a novel, for example, or a short story. Oftentimes it's romanticized, like in poetry, right? The conflicts seem larger than life, bigger than reality. In a play, there's an attempt to present the world as it is, right? So all of that conflict will very much be a human kind of conflict, things that real people in the real world at this time, in this place, would experience. It should be believable. Dramatic conflict then requires obstacles, right? And an obstacle is what it sounds like. It's any resistance to a character having or getting what they want. So a play's conflict is between what someone wants and what hinders its attainment. It is realism, right? We could compare that to a novel's conflict that might be some big idea, right? Some thematic thing like free will versus fate, right? Independence versus destiny. Or a poem's conflict might be the theme of age versus youth, right? Or intellect versus beauty. Those very sort of vague, not easily defined conflicts. In drama, it's all about the people, right? And what people really want, how they try to get it, and what is stopping them, what is hindering them from attaining it. So in Edward II, we've got an obstacle for Gaveston, right, is probably one of the first things that occurs. One obstacle that he has is the court of Edward II. The court is definitely jealous about Gaveston's role. They're prejudiced about Gaveston's relationship with the king, and Gaveston has to overcome this obstacle if Stasis is to be returned, right? And as you read the play, you know that he fails in this regard. But that first obstacle there, is the court. The conflict occurs then between the wishes of the court and the wishes of Edward II. Amid and after the quarreling, right, the first conflict is resolved when Edward II agrees to the court's demands. So Gaveston cannot overcome the obstacle of the court. He can't get a good opinion of them. He can't get them on his side, which leads to the conflict between the court confronting Edward about Gaveston. And ultimately, that conflict is resolved by Edward agreeing with the court, essentially agreeing to do what they say. What does that mean? Well, it has to set up a new obstacle and conflict, right? Because drama is action, because drama is conflict, each resolution leads to a new obstacle and conflict. Just like each event leads to another event which creates an action, each action has an obstacle and a conflict, the resolution of which leads to another conflict, at least until we get to the end of the play and hopefully some kind of stasis is returned. So the outcome of this resolution is, of course, a new obstacle. And it is, in this case, the relationship between, or the situation that develops between Gaveston and Isabella. Right? So this is one of those dramatic event moments when, as we discussed earlier, a heap becomes a trigger. The heap is Edward sending away Gaveston again, and that becomes a trigger for Isabella. The last thing that I wanted to bring attention to is this sort of vague area that we refer to as theatrical things, or some people call it all things theatrical, right? Playwrights put their most important material into the play's most theatrical moments, their biggest moments, their most profound moments, and of course they do this on purpose. Those are the moments that stand out to the audience, and so they're trying to take advantage of the audience's heightened attention in those moments by packing in the most important material in the most opportune of places. So when we say look for the theatrical things in those big moments, what we're talking about is what are the things that are eliciting the strong audience responses. For us, it's going to be in the reading, but if you watch an adaptation of the play on video, for example, or if you go see a play, we want to gauge audience response, and the larger the response, it's more likely more theatrical things are happening in that moment. I've got a few listed here generally that have lots of subparts, but there is more for you to dissect in this week's supplemental article called How to Read a Play. So give that a thorough look through, and you'll see a lot of different categories for theatrical things that you should be assessing for, evaluating for, and analyzing as you're reading through Edward II and then eventually A Raisin in the Sun. Some that I have listed here that are pretty common. Humor, right, is great for audience reaction in really funny moments. Don't be distracted by the humor. When characters are saying hilarious things or doing hilarious things, you can think about those jester characters from Shakespeare, for example. Humor will get the audience involved, but if you're paying close attention, if you're reading carefully, there's also a lot of theatrical things occurring within those heightened moments of humor. We're getting a lot of important information. Maybe an important event is unfolding that is going to be extremely significant later on in the play. So when you feel yourself getting the funnies or any other kind of emotion, you want to be paying attention. Something is happening there. Same thing with tragedy, right? If there's a moment, a character that we've been developing a relationship with, and something happens to that character, it's sad because it's sad, but that's also a heightened emotional moment where something else is probably happening, and we want to play close attention. Same thing for suspense and action. Any very vigorously moving action, especially when a lot is happening very quickly, don't let yourself get swept away with the story in those moments. It's difficult, right? But pull it back and make sure you're paying attention to what is it that is causing all of that action and that movement, because it is probably something that's extremely important to the dramatic plot. Conflict, of course, anytime there's tension, that is going to be important. Novelty, meaning something new happens or something is delivered in a new way, an original way that's would be unfamiliar to the contemporary audience. You want to pay attention to those moments. It's the playwright, the dramatist trying something, right? And if they have the courage to try something new in a particular moment in the play, it's probably because they're trying to express something important. So we should be cautious there. And then, of course, change. Whenever we sense a significant change in tone, in style, in location, in a character's point of view, who's in charge of propelling the story at a particular time, if it moves from one perspective to another, make note of that change, take a pause, and evaluate. Analyze, okay, what is changing here? Why is it changing? I need to remember to go back. I need to mark my place on the page here so that I can return when I'm doing my backwards reading or my backwards analysis of the events to this change. I need to be able to articulate why did it happen and what effect did it have on everything that came after. So this week we'll practice engaging with all of these terms. Of course, you can feel free to rewatch this lecture video and do the supplementary reading, which will help. But in your first set of reading notes, which are due Sunday, September 8th, I'd like you to try and demonstrate your new understanding of, and of course your active engagement, with the dramatic terminology laid out here in our first week reading Edward II. So mark the moments of stasis and intrusion as you find them. Note where you see a trigger and a heap, an obstacle, and the conflict that is caused by that obstacle. Also mark any theatrical things that you encounter, right? And maybe leave a little note for yourself about what you think that means. Is there a moment of humor? Why is it there? What else is happening in the background? Is there something new that is happening in the play or that the playwright is trying? You can sometimes rely on reading notes in the plays for information like this. You'll see if you have the new Mermaids copy, for example, of Edward II, lots of reading notes at the bottom that may be helpful in explaining things of novelty. Is there a tragedy that occurs, something that's sad or otherwise emotionally heightened? What's behind that emotion? What's creating it? And then, of course, there's the more comprehensive list of items to look for in one of our supplemental readings for the week, How to Read a Play. So if you read that along with the Introduction to Edward II, our chapter from Reading and Writing About Literature, put all of this together to try and get a handle on how do we go about the business of reading and analyzing a play. The first rule is we do it slowly and carefully, right? We pay attention to the way that we're responding. And then we mark the actual technical things that are happening as they happen. Stasis and intrusion, obstacle and conflict, trigger and heap, right? And any theatrical things. So in addition to your reading notes on Edward II, marking up all of these dramatic terms as you encounter them in your reading. Also, of course, include your reactions to the other assigned readings. Try to synthesize if you can. And what I mean by that is, how does what you're reading in your textbook, Reading and Writing About Literature, work with or correspond to what you read this week in that article, How to Read a Play? Is there any overlay there? Any back and forth? Any confusions or conflicting information? Or you might think about, how does what you read in the article titled An Introduction to Edward II, which is linked up in our drama unit, how does that work with your first half reading of Edward II? Did you learn any new information about the history, the politics of the time, the religion, that informed your reading of Edward II in an interesting way, right? And helps you understand why certain moments of intrusion or conflict or novelty were actually significant. So that's it for this week. You'll have another discussion due in week 3 that will continue to build on Edward II and these terms. But for this week, it's your reading notes. Remember, 1 page minimum. Analyze to the best of your ability. Let me see what's engaging you as a reader. Quotes that you thought were interesting and why you thought they were interesting. What do you think they mean? Terms that you didn't know that you had to look up. New information that you have. How does this reading reflect your understanding of other readings, or how can you relate, right, in any real way to Edward II or to what you're reading in the textbook this week, etc. Any questions, of course, let me know. Contact me via email or check the FAQ discussion.